If you're going to load the kiln, the first thing you need to do is prep the pieces for loading. For the first firing, for the after sculpting, you'll need to go through and smooth out any rough edges. And the clay is fairly soft at this point, so all that's really needed is a wet sponge and just lightly rub any rough spots. If there's a lot of details on the project or a lot of added pieces, you're going to want to be extra careful. Some of the shields and creatures you may not even want to touch around the pieces that have been added, so that you're careful not to break off any of the pieces. But for the younger kids, definitely you're going to want to get the edges nice and smooth, because the little bits get really sharp and pointy once they've been fired. So, and then for glazed pieces, you should have them, during the glazing process, you should be instructing them not to paint the bottoms of the projects, but they do kind of drip and creep around the back edges while they're painting. So you're definitely going to make sure that any extra glaze is wiped off. And it does wipe off fairly easily. And you just need to make sure that any piece that's going to actually be touching the kiln shelf needs to be cleaned off. If it's on the side edges, that's fine, it won't drip, but just flip it over and look to see the points where it's actually touching the flat surface, and that's what needs to be cleaned off. Once everything's prepped, you're going to want to actually load your pieces into the kiln. You can see that I've got some stilts in the bottom of the kiln right now. One thing you need to be aware of is this nozzle where the heat comes in. You need to make sure that none of the shelves are actually touching that nozzle. So you want to make sure that the shelf below is fine and the shelf above is fine, that there's a little bit of clearance around that nozzle. And then determining the size of the stilts that you use, you just want to set your piece down and put a couple of stilts around it and make sure that there's going to be about a ½ inch of clearance at least. So for a bigger piece, you'd want slightly bigger stilts. So definitely a little bit of clearance between the actual piece and the tops of the stilts. For the bisque firing, the first firing, the pieces can be touching, it's not a problem. They're not going to stick together. But once you have them glazed, you definitely want to leave at least a1/4 inch between the individual pieces, the stilts, the sides of the kiln wall. That can't be touching anything, because the glaze will fuse to the other pieces and stick. If you have a mix of different sizes of pieces and you've got an empty space but nothing will quite fit in there, you can put one of these risers in, just again making sure that it's not touching anything, and then you can put your piece on top of the riser, and that gives you a little more surface area to work with and get one more piece in there. Then you need to load a kiln plate on top of the risers. I suggest doing this with 2 hands. I'm trying to do it with 1 hand, but it just sits on the risers. So you've got your kiln plate in there. There's a little gap. You can't really see it with this video, but there's a little gap between the nozzle and the kiln plate. And then from there, you can continue to put more risers in. I suggest 4 risers. That makes it nice and stable. 4 risers evenly spaced. and then you can put another layer of projects in there, and then you can keep building up. You don't want any projects to go above this top line of the kiln, so that there's a little bit of clearance between the top of the projects and the kiln lid. You'll need to keep in mind when loading the kiln that freshly sculpted projects need to sit on the shelf drying for a minimum of 2 days. If they're fairly thin and don't have a lot of decoration, then the 2 days is gonna be fine. If they're thicker, like some of the pinch pots, some of the shields end up with a lot of decorations and they get a little thick. If they're really thick, then they're going to require another day or so to dry. 3 days for thicker, 3 to 4 days for thicker, but 2 days for the thin stuff. Glazed projects, pretty much as soon as they're glazed, they can go in the kiln. Doesn't require any specific amount of drying time. The running instructions are right here, so it's got pretty simple instructions on how to run it. If you were, and this is the control panel for the kiln itself. So once you've got it loaded, you close the lid. The first thing you do is push stop, and then if you are doing the first firing, the bisque firing, after sculpting, you push slow bisque, and then enter, and then we fire on cone 4, so it's 0, 4, enter. Enter again, because we're not holding the kiln, we want to start it right away, and then start. And then you'll hear it click, and it'll click on and off a few times, and that means it's going. The kiln will run for about 8 to 10 hours, I believe, and then it needs a full day to cool down. It'll be super hot. It gets, I believe it gets up to 1300 degrees, so do not try to open the kiln while it's running. It is massively hot. For glaze, same procedure, start, but this will be slow glaze, enter, and the cone is 0, 6, enter, enter again for a 0 hold because you're starting it right away, and start, same thing. Same running time, so the kiln is basically occupied for 2 days. So that's why we schedule everything, the projects, at least 2 weeks apart, because it takes a couple of days for the project to dry on the rack. It takes a couple of days in the kiln, and then you have to factor in the other classes that are coming in. So if you've got several projects sitting on the shelves to go in, then you've got to make sure that everything gets done by the glaze date for the class. Once it's cooled down, all you have to do is just open the top of the kiln and unload.